I lost my marriage, my beautiful suburban home, and my dignity, all because I thought I was smarter than the man I married. I wasn't. I want to be really clear about that before I say anything else, because everything that comes after is going to sound like I'm making excuses. I'm not. I'm just trying to explain how a reasonably intelligent, reasonably decent woman can slowly, deliberately destroy the best thing in her life and tell herself the whole time that she deserves better. She doesn't. I didn't. But let me start at the beginning. Tony and I got married 7 years ago in a small ceremony at his parents' backyard in Lakewood. Nothing fancy. His mom made tamales. My cousin cried through the entire vow exchange. It was genuinely lovely, and I remember standing there in my dress thinking, this is it. This is the good version of my life. And it was for a long time. It really was. We bought our house in a quiet subdivision in Arvada. One of those neighborhoods where every garage has a basketball hoop, and the HOA sends passive-aggressive emails about lawn edging. 30-year mortgage. 4% interest rate that Tony researched for 2 months before we signed anything, because that's who he is. He's an IT infrastructure manager for a mid-size healthcare company downtown. Good salary, stable hours. The kind of man who sets up automatic transfers to a high-yield savings account and actually checks that it's working. I worked part-time as an admin coordinator for a dental group on Wadsworth. It paid fine, not exciting, but fine. And that word, fine, is basically the honest summary of how I felt about my life by year 6. Not unhappy, not mistreated, just fine. Like I'd ordered something from a menu that sounded amazing and it arrived perfectly cooked, but somehow I wasn't hungry anymore. Tony wasn't a bad husband. I need you to hear that. He didn't ignore me or belittle me. He made coffee every morning without being asked. He remembered that I hate cilantro. He drove 40 minutes to pick up my favorite enchiladas on my birthday, even though it was raining and he had an early meeting the next day. He was good. But I had stopped seeing the good. I'd started cataloging the predictable instead. The same Friday night pizza order, the same recycled jokes with the same neighbors at the same HOA block party every August. I felt like a background character in my own life, drifting through the same weekly loop. Target on Sundays, meal prep on Mondays, nothing that surprised me, nothing that made me feel like I was me anymore. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a woman manufacturing a reason, because it was. I bumped into Ian at a Whole Foods on a Tuesday in March. I was grabbing sparkling water and he was standing in the hot bar line, looking exactly disheveled enough to seem interesting. Ian Calloway, my college boyfriend from 22 years old, the one who'd broken up with me over a text message the summer after junior year, and then had the audacity to follow me on Instagram 6 years later. He said my name like we were old friends. He smiled that specific smile, the one that used to make me feel chosen. We got coffee in the parking lot. He talked about how he'd moved back to Denver after a rough few years in Austin, how things hadn't worked out the way he planned, how he was staying with a friend while he figured things out. He had this energy like everything was temporary, like real life was still arriving any day now. It was the opposite of my kitchen calendar with Tony's work trips color-coded in blue. I drove home thinking about him the whole way. I should have deleted his number. I know that now. I knew it then honestly, but I told myself it was harmless. We were just catching up. It wasn't anything. It became something fast. Within 3 weeks we were texting constantly. Not anything explicitly romantic at first, just the kind of long, winding conversations I'd stopped having with Tony. Ian remembered things I'd said in college. He asked questions like he was genuinely curious about my answers. He made me feel like I was interesting again. Then came the complaints about money. It started subtle. A comment about his car registration being overdue. A mention that his friend was charging him rent and things were tight. Then more direct. A medical bill he hadn't expected. A freelance client who hadn't paid him. A tone in his text that wasn't quite asking but was shaped like a question. I told myself Ian just needed help getting back on his feet. Then I told myself Tony would never find out. Then I needed a reason for the cash. I've thought a lot about the exact moment I crossed the real line. Not the emotional affair, that was bad enough. The lie. The engineered, calculated lie I built specifically to reach into my husband's trust and steal from it. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday night, watching Tony load the dishwasher with the methodical care he applies to everything, and I said the words that would end my marriage 8 months later. Tony, I got a call from Max today. He's in real trouble. My brother Max hadn't called me in 4 months. He was living in Munich, working in logistics, sending me the occasional photo of German Christmas markets. He was fine, more than fine, but Tony didn't know that. Tony and Max had met exactly twice. I watched my husband turn around from the sink, drying his hands on the dish towel we'd bought at a Crate and Barrel outlet. His face went immediately serious. That quiet, dependable concern that was so fundamentally him. "What kind of trouble?" he asked. "Gambling debts," I said. "People he owes money to. It's bad, Tony." He didn't ask me a single skeptical question. He just nodded slowly, exhaled, and said, "Okay. How much does he need?" I drove to Ian's apartment the following Saturday morning with an envelope of cash in my purse, $300 from the joint savings account that Tony had been funding for 6 years, with disciplined automatic transfers. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of sharp Denver March day where the mountains look like they've been cut out of paper. My hands weren't shaking. That's the part I'm most ashamed of. They weren't shaking at all. There was just this sick electric feeling in my chest, something between guilt and adrenaline, as I merged onto I-70 and told myself that everything would be fine, that I was in control, that Tony would never know. There is a specific kind of shame that doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrives in layers, the way mold grows, slowly, quietly, underneath something that still looks fine on the surface. By April, I had developed a Saturday morning routine so practiced and so efficient that it frightened me a little. In the rare moments I allowed myself to think about it clearly, I would wake up before Tony. That part was easy. He liked to sleep in on weekends, one of his few indulgences. I'd shower, get dressed in something casual, and by 7:45 I'd be in the kitchen making coffee like everything was normal. If Tony shuffled out before I left, I'd smile and say I was running to Target or meeting my coworker Diane for a walk at Stanley Lake. He never questioned it. Why would he? I'd never given him a reason to. The drive to Ian's apartment in Lakewood took about 22 minutes without traffic. I had the route memorized within the first 3 weeks. I want to describe those two places to you because I think the contrast tells you everything you need to know about the choices I was making and why they made absolutely no sense from the outside. Our house on Saturday mornings was genuinely beautiful in that quiet, early light way that you stop noticing when you live somewhere long enough. Tony had a habit of turning on the kitchen pendant lights before the sun fully came up, so the whole main floor glowed warm and amber. He'd bought a cast iron skillet the previous fall and had gotten serious about weekend breakfasts. Eggs over easy, turkey sausage, sliced fruit he'd arrange on the cutting board in a way that was completely unnecessary and completely him. The house smelled like coffee and dish soap. The floors were clean. There was a permission slip from a neighbor's kid still on our fridge with a little magnet shaped like Colorado that we'd bought at a rest stop on a road trip 4 years ago. It was a home, a real, lived-in, cared-for home. Ian's apartment was a second-floor unit in a complex off Colfax that had definitely been nicer in a previous decade. The parking lot always had one car with a broken window that never seemed to get fixed. His door had a sticker residue outline where something had been peeled off years ago. Inside, the blinds were always half closed. There were takeout containers on the counter that existed in a rotating cast. Different restaurants, same general state of abandonment. A flannel blanket bunched at one end of the couch. A smell that I can only describe as stale. Stale air, stale beer, a faint undertone of laundry, left in the washer too long. I would hand Ian the envelope. He'd take it without counting it in front of me, usually, which I think was a calculated performance of nonchalance. Then he'd set it on the kitchen counter next to whatever was there, and we'd talk, and I would sit on that couch and tell myself that this was something meaningful, that I was here because of a genuine emotional connection and not because I had already wrecked things so thoroughly at home that I didn't know how to reverse course. That's what I told myself. I'm not sure I believed it even then. By May, Ian had stopped being subtle. "This isn't enough," he said one Saturday, in a tone that wasn't quite angry, but wasn't kind either. He was standing in the kitchen, and he'd actually opened the envelope this time, fanning the bills like he was vaguely disappointed by a hand of cards. "Anna, I've got 3 months of back rent here. $300 isn't... This doesn't do anything." "It's what I can pull without Tony noticing," I said. "Then figure out how to pull more." He set the envelope down. "I mean it. I'm not going to keep doing this if you can't actually show up for me." Show up for me. I remember that specific phrase sitting in my chest like a stone. He threatened to end things. Not dramatically, not with raised voices, just with this cold, exhausted withdrawal that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. He'd go quiet. He'd stop texting for 2 days. And I would sit in my beautiful amber-lit kitchen across from my husband and feel like I was disappearing from the inside. So I showed up more. 500 one week, 650 the next. I had access to our joint savings account, the one with the automatic transfers, the one Tony had been building methodically for 6 years, the one earmarked for the kitchen renovation we'd been loosely planning, the one that had a running spreadsheet Tony updated every quarter with projected timelines. $41,000 sitting there. I started making transfers to my personal checking account. 200 here, 300 there. Amounts small enough to feel temporary. Amounts I told myself I'd replace. I never replaced a single dollar. Tony noticed I was losing weight before I noticed it myself. "Hey," he said one evening in early June, catching my hand as I passed him in the hallway. He had this way of doing that, just reaching out, not grabby, just present. "You okay? You've seemed far away lately." "I'm just stressed about Max," I said. I had rehearsed that line so many times it came out perfectly natural. He nodded slowly, rubbing his thumb across my knuckles in that absent, habitual way of his. "I know. We'll get him through it." He paused. "I've actually been looking into weekend infrastructure consulting. A few companies post contracts on the side. I could pick up maybe 800-900 extra a month if I committed to it." I stared at him. "Tony, you don't have to do that." "He's your brother," he said simply, like that settled it. Like family obligation was just a fact of physics. He went back to whatever he'd been doing, and I stood in the hallway of our home and felt something corrosive move through my chest. Not enough to stop. That's the honest, humiliating truth. I felt the guilt, identified it clearly, and kept going anyway. It was a Sunday evening in late June when Tony looked up from his laptop at the kitchen table, the same table where I had first told the lie about Max, and said completely casually, "You know what I was thinking?" I was unloading the dishwasher. "What?" "We should have Max over. End of July, maybe. Do a proper BBQ, give him a chance to decompress." He closed the laptop halfway, warming to the idea in real time. I could talk to him man to man, work out a real repayment structure, take the pressure off you managing it alone. It'd be good for him to feel like family, right? The plate in my hand didn't drop. I held it. I set it carefully in the cabinet. "Yeah," I heard myself say. Let me check with him on timing." Tony smiled and opened his laptop again, already moving on. I turned back to the dishwasher so he couldn't see my face. My brother was in Munich. My brother had been in Munich for almost a year. My brother posted photos of the Isar River on Instagram and had mentioned, just 2 weeks earlier in a text thread with our mom, that he'd finally paid off his student loans. There was no sound in my ears. My hands had gone cold. I stood at the open dishwasher and felt the entire architecture of my lie begin to tilt, slowly like a building that hasn't fallen yet but has already decided to. I had no idea yet that it was already over. I just knew that I was running out of walls to hide behind. I have replayed that last Saturday so many times that the memory has started to feel worn, like a photograph handled too often. It was mid-July. Denver was in the middle of one of those brutal, high-altitude heat waves where the sun feels personal, like it has a specific problem with you. I pulled out of our neighborhood at 7:52 in the morning, coffee in the cup holder, an envelope with $800 in my purse, the single largest amount I had ever brought him. Ian had asked for it 4 days earlier over text. No explanation, just a number and an expectation. I had moved the money the same afternoon without letting myself think about it too long. I remember checking my mirrors at the neighborhood exit, this unconscious habit I had developed over months of Saturday departures, making sure no one I knew was watching me leave. $41,000. That's how much had been in that savings account in March. I had not checked the balance in 3 weeks because some part of me had decided that not knowing was a form of protection. It wasn't. It was just cowardice with a different name. Ian didn't answer the door for almost 4 minutes after I knocked. When he finally opened it, he was in a t-shirt and basketball shorts, hair flattened on one side, phone already in his hand. He looked at me the way you look at a delivery notification. mildly relevant, quickly processed. "Hey," he said, stepping back to let me in without actually welcoming me. The apartment was worse than usual. There were 2 pizza boxes on the coffee table, both open, both empty except for a scatter of dried cheese and a stack of napkins. The blinds were closed entirely this time, so the whole space existed in this yellowish dimness that made everything look slightly diseased. It smelled overwhelmingly like whatever air freshener he'd sprayed recently over something he didn't want to explain. I took the envelope out of my purse and held it out to him. He took it, counted it. All the way through this time, thumb flicking each bill with the practiced efficiency of someone who has counted cash handed to them before. Probably more than once, probably from more than one person. "It's $800, I said. "Yeah." He folded the envelope and set it in the kitchen drawer, just like that. Closed the drawer, turned back to his phone. Something shifted in me in that exact moment. I don't know if it was the drawer, the casualness of it, the way $800 of my husband's savings disappeared into a junk drawer next to takeout menus and dead batteries, or if it was the weeks of smaller things finally reaching a tipping point. But I looked at Ian Calloway standing in his dim, stale apartment in his wrinkled t-shirt, already scrolling, already somewhere else, and the specific spell that had apparently governed my entire brain for 4 months simply broke. He wasn't magnetic. He wasn't complicated or interesting or a romantic escape from my predictable life. He was a 44-year-old man with a mattress on a box spring and no shower curtain rod. I could see the bare rod through the half-open bathroom door, who had identified something weak in me and walked straight through it. That was it. That was the whole thing. I thought about Tony researching mortgage interest rates for 2 months. I thought about the magnet shaped like Colorado on our fridge. I thought about $800 sitting in a junk drawer. "I should go," I said. Ian looked up from his phone with an expression of complete indifference. "Okay. No, drive safe. No, I'll text you later." Just the faint sound of his thumb resuming its scroll before I had even reached the door. I sat in my car in his parking lot for 6 minutes. I know it was 6 because I watched the clock without meaning to. The broken window car was still there. A kid on a bike cut through the far end of the lot and disappeared. The sun was already doing serious damage to the day. I felt dirty in a way that had nothing to do with anything physical. I felt like someone had handed me a mirror I'd been successfully avoiding for months, and now I had no choice but to stand there and look at myself in it. I drove home through the heat thinking about how I was going to fix it, how I would end things with Ian, how I would find a way to quietly replace the money, maybe over a year, maybe 2, how Tony would never have to know any of it, how I would be better, how I would be the person who almost made a catastrophic mistake but caught herself in time. I was so focused on the story I was going to tell myself that I didn't notice, until much later, that the timeline had already slipped completely out of my hands. Here is what I did not know was happening while I sat in that parking lot making private promises to myself. Tony had run out of a specific deck screw on a Saturday morning project in the backyard. He'd been building a small raised garden bed, something he'd mentioned wanting to do for 2 summers, and had driven to the Home Depot on Wadsworth around 9:15 in the morning. He was in the lumber and fasteners aisle when he heard someone say his name. I know all of this because Tony told me later, in the specific, sequential way he tells things when he wants to make sure there are no misunderstandings. He turned around, and standing there with a cart and a bag of mulch and a lanyard from some downtown tech conference was my brother Max. My brother Max, who is tall, who has our mother's eyes, who Tony had met exactly twice, but remembered clearly because Tony remembers everything. My brother Max, who was wearing a t-shirt from a Munich running event with the year printed on the sleeve. Last year's year. Tony said he smiled. He said he went over and shook Max's hand genuinely, because Tony is genuinely warm, and asked how he was doing, and said something careful and kind about the situation. Something like, "Anna's been worried, but we're glad we could help. How are you holding up with everything?" And Max looked at him with polite, total confusion and said, "Help with what? What situation?" Tony said he kept his voice very even. He asked a few more careful questions, and within 4 minutes in a Home Depot lumber aisle, he understood everything. Max had been in Munich for 11 months. He worked remote IT for a European logistics firm. He made more than Tony did. He had no gambling debts, no bookies, no financial emergency. He had flown in 3 days ago to handle a visa renewal and had stopped at Home Depot on the way to their mother's house because she needed potting soil. He was completely fine. I was 20 minutes away in a parking lot on Colfax, making promises to myself about the future. The house was quiet when I got home. That was the first thing. On a Saturday afternoon in summer, Tony usually had music on. Not loud, just something in the background, whatever playlist he'd been working through. The absence of it registered somewhere below my conscious awareness as I came through the garage door. The kitchen lights were off. He was sitting at the island in the dark. Not slumped, not dramatic, just sitting, the way you sit when you've been sitting for a while and have run out of reasons to move. His hands were flat on the counter on either side of 2 pieces of paper. Printed bank statements. I could see the account header from the doorway. And his phone, screen up, displaying a photo that made my entire body go cold from the feet up. Max, standing in front of a Frankfurt airport sign, tagged in a post from 3 weeks ago. Tony looked at me. I have tried many times to find the right word for his expression, and I keep landing on the same one, done. Not angry, not devastated, not even hurt in the way I might have imagined. Just completely, quietly, irrevocably done. Like a door that has already closed and simply hasn't been told to stop swinging yet. The silence lasted long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycling on. Then he said, in a voice so calm it was its own kind of violence, "Who have you been giving my money to every Saturday, Anna? The savings account art for. What's left?" I used to think that when everything fell apart, there would be noise. That's what I had always imagined. In the vague, unexamined way you imagine consequences you don't actually believe are coming. Raised voices, broken dishes, the dramatic release of pressure that television has taught us to expect from a moment of complete and total exposure. Something that would at least match the scale of what I had done. Tony gave me none of that. He just sat there at the kitchen island in the dark and waited for my answer with the patient, level stillness of a man who had already done all of his falling apart in private, somewhere between a Home Depot lumber aisle and our driveway, and had arrived at this moment already rebuilt into something I didn't recognize and could not reach. I tried to lie. I want to be honest about that. Even then, caught completely, I felt my brain reach reflexively for another layer of story. Something about a friend in trouble, something about not wanting to worry him. The lie was already forming before I recognized what I was doing, and it was the recognizing, seeing myself constructed in real time, in front of a man who already knew everything, that finally broke me open. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically. My legs just made that decision independently. I told him everything, Ian's name, how we'd met at Whole Foods, the Saturdays, the envelopes, the transfers, all of them, every amount, the running total I had been refusing to calculate finally arriving in my mouth as a number that sounded impossible even as I said it. I told him about the lie, about Max, about sitting at this exact table and watching him dry his hands on the dish towel and saying the words that I knew, even as I said them, were going to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I cried through most of it, not the elegant kind of crying, the ugly, comprehensive kind that has no dignity and asks for none. Tony did not move from his stool. He did not touch me. He did not fill any of my pauses with reassurance or anger or any of the emotional feedback that I had not realized, until its complete absence, that I had been counting on. He just listened with his hands still flat on the counter and his face holding that expression I still don't have a better word for than done. When I finished, the kitchen was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, pushed the bank statements to the side in a small, tidy gesture, picked up his phone and slid it into his pocket. "Okay," he said. That was it. That was the whole response. He walked down the hallway to our bedroom and I heard the closet open, drawers, the specific zip of the duffel bag he took on work trips, a dark green one his mother had given him years ago that lived on the top shelf. It took him 11 minutes. I know because I was still on the kitchen floor watching the clock on the microwave, the way you fixate on something small and irrelevant when the large things are too enormous to look at directly. He came back through the kitchen with the duffel over one shoulder. He set his house keys on the counter. Not thrown, not placed with emphasis, just set down, the most ordinary sound in the world. And he looked at me one final time. "I funded my own betrayal," he said quietly. "Every Saturday, because I thought he was your brother." He walked out through the garage door. I heard his car back out. I heard the neighborhood sounds. A sprinkler system cycling on 2 houses down. A dog somewhere, the absolute indifference of a summer afternoon in the suburbs. And then nothing. I drove to Ian's apartment. I don't know what I was expecting. Comfort, maybe. The irrational logic of a person who has just lost everything reaching toward the thing she lost it for, as if proximity to it might retroactively justify the cost. Ian opened the door and read my face in approximately 3 seconds. "Tony knows," I said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not concern, not guilt, just a rapid, practical recalculation. He asked 2 questions in quick succession. Did Tony know his name? And was I going to be able to access the savings account anymore? When I answered yes and no in that order, he told me he thought I should leave. That this had gotten too complicated. That I had brought this to his door and he wasn't going to deal with the fallout of my choices. My choices. He said it without a trace of irony. I drove around for 2 hours after that because I had nowhere to go. That is not a metaphor. I had genuinely no destination. I called my mother and she didn't answer. I thought about calling Max and understood immediately and completely why I could not. I ended up at a Denny's on Federal, drinking coffee I didn't want, watching the Saturday lunch crowd come and go. That was 14 months ago. I'm writing this from a 1-bedroom apartment in Wheat Ridge that cost me $1,340 a month and has a bathroom exhaust fan that runs loud and a parking spot that isn't covered, so my car gets hail damaged every summer. I work full-time now at a medical billing office because I needed the insurance. I eat a lot of meals that come in single-serving containers, designed for people eating alone. The divorce finalized in February. Tony kept the house. My attorney said I had very little leverage, which is a professional way of saying what we both already knew, which is that I had no case to make. I heard through my cousin that Tony repainted the kitchen, that he joined a recreational soccer league, that he seems, by all available accounts, to be doing the steady, incremental work of becoming okay. The same way he approaches everything, methodically, without drama, one automatic transfer at a time. Max won't return my calls. He sent one text, 3 weeks after everything came out, that said only, "I vouched for you your whole life. Don't contact me for a while." That was it. That was the whole text. I've read it probably 200 times, which I recognize is not healthy, but some sentences deserve to be read until they're fully understood. Ian changed his number, in case you were wondering. Here is what I know now that I did not know then, or knew and refused to apply to myself. Boring loyalty is not a prison, it is infrastructure. It is the thing that holds the weight of an actual life. A real, specific, irreplaceable life with a cast iron skillet and a Colorado magnet, and a man who drives 40 minutes in the rain for your birthday, because he loves you in the practical, daily, unsexy way that actually means something. I had all of that. I had a man who would have done anything for me, who did do anything for me, who sat across from a lie I told him about my brother and said, "Okay, how much does he need?" without a moment of suspicion, because he trusted me completely. He trusted me the way you trust the foundation of your house, not consciously, not with effort, just as a basic fact of how the world is structured. And I took that trust and I handed it, in envelopes, to a man who kept it in a junk drawer. I think about Ian's junk drawer a lot, actually. About what it means that $800 of Tony's savings, money that Tony had earned at a job he drove to every day in traffic, money he had planned and tracked and set aside for a future we were supposed to build together, ended up next to expired coupons and takeout menus, in the apartment of a man who couldn't be bothered to hang a shower curtain rod. That's where I put it. That's what I decided it was worth. I am 39 years old, and I live alone, and I made this, every single piece of it. There's no version of this story where I'm the victim. I've checked. I've looked at it from every angle available to me in the 14 months I've had nothing but time and a loud exhaust fan and my own company. I was handed a good life by a good man, and I burned it to the ground because I mistook comfort for invisibility and flattery for love. Don't do what I did. That's the whole lesson. I wish it were more complicated, because complicated would at least be interesting. It isn't. It's just that simple, and it cost everything.